Hola? What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
They said it like they were doing me a favor, like sparing me from something exhausting and unnecessary, like dragging me through mud they didn't think I had the strength to crawl out of. College is a waste for girls, my father said one night after dinner, wiping his hands on a stained paper towel, like that somehow made the conversation cleaner. My mother nodded, not out of agreement exactly, but out of habit. The way someone nods when they've heard the same words so many times they've stopped bothering to test them. I was 17, just a few weeks from graduation, and already I could feel the door closing behind me before I had a chance to walk through it. They weren't cruel people, not in the obvious sense. They didn't yell or hit. They didn't chain me to the stove or forbid me from reading books. They simply believed in a version of life where women took up less space, where dreams were something you traded for diapers and dinner, where daughters were raised to serve and sons were raised to shine. It was the way things had always been, my mother would say when I asked why Louise got new shoes for no reason, and I had to wear flats 2 sizes too small. Men need to look sharp, she'd say. You'll understand when you're older. I understood a long time before they thought I would. Luis, my older brother by 2 years, had his college plans laid out like a royal procession. They started talking about it when he was 15, whether he wanted to study in Spain or maybe Australia, what kind of accommodations he'd need, how much spending money he should get per month. He didn't even have decent grades, but it didn't matter. He had charm and my father's jawline, and a way of making mediocrity look like potential. By the time he turned 18, they had taken out a second mortgage to send him to a business school in Paris that cost more than my parents' combined annual salary. No one blinked. My mom even cried when she watched him pack his suitcase. Meanwhile, I was told to consider getting a job at the bakery down the street, or maybe the dry cleaner, since they were hiring and the work wasn't too heavy. I said nothing when they suggested it, though my stomach twisted so tightly it felt like it might turn inside out. I had applied to 2 local colleges on my own, forged my mother's signature on the FAFSA form, and pieced together a shaky financial aid package that covered tuition, but not much else. I didn't ask them for a dime. I already knew the answer. The day Luis left for Paris, they took photos in front of the house, the suitcase gleaming behind him like some kind of trophy. I stood just off to the side, holding the camera, pretending to smile. He wore sunglasses he hadn't paid for, and cologne that made the whole front yard reek of expensive indifference. My father said he was proud. My mother said he was going to do great things. No one said anything to me. 3 weeks later, I signed the lease on a 1-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from campus and started classes at the community college downtown. My job at the dry cleaner started at 5 a.m., and I took classes from 7 to 11, then worked a second shift in the evenings at a bookstore. I ate microwave noodles in my car between classes and taught myself how to study while folding customer laundry. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't easy, but every small win felt like a secret I was keeping from the world, a rebellion no one could take from me. That first semester, I earned straight A's. No one asked. I didn't tell. My parents assumed I was still living at home, saving money, figuring things out. I let them believe that. Let them think I was floating while their son was supposedly soaring. I knew the truth. Luis had failed 2 classes by midterms and was already begging for more money to help cover living costs. He spent more time at clubs than in classrooms, but my father defended him every time. He's adjusting, it's hard out there. I stopped coming home for dinner. My mother said I was being ungrateful. My father stopped talking to me altogether. I kept my head down, finished assignments in parking lots, and printed my essays at the library at midnight because I couldn't afford a printer. I didn't complain. I didn't raise my voice. I just signed the papers, enrolled in more classes, took on more hours, applied for every scholarship I could find, even the weird ones, like the essay contest about cheese packaging that somehow paid out $200 and kept my lights on for another month. I kept everything to myself. There was no room for sympathy or explanation. I knew if I waited for them to change, I'd still be waiting 10 years from now, So I moved in silence, and every step I took forward felt like a step away from them, from the people who couldn't see my worth because it didn't look like the picture they had in their heads. My revenge wasn't loud. It was slow and steady and made entirely of work they never thought I could do. But that night, standing in the back room of the dry cleaner after closing, when my boss looked over my shoulder at the homework spread across the folding table and said, "You're too smart for this place," something clicked. She didn't mean it as an insult, but it stuck. I went home and opened a new tab on my laptop. The application to transfer into a state university had been sitting in my bookmarks for months, untouched. That night, I filled it out. I didn't tell anyone, I just signed the papers. Then I clicked submit and went to bed. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew, whatever it was going to belong entirely to me. The first time I stepped onto the state university campus as an enrolled student, I didn't feel like I belonged. Not because I wasn't smart enough or driven enough, but because everything around me seemed soaked in a privilege I had never been granted. The buildings were polished, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the students looked like they had all just stepped out of a catalog designed for upper-middle-class comfort and casual intellectualism. I wore the same thrifted backpack I'd had since high school, carried 3 used textbooks in my arms because I couldn't afford a bag big enough to hold them all, and walked like someone who was still learning to believe she had earned a place at the table. I didn't live on campus. I couldn't. My apartment was still the same dingy 1-bedroom above a nail salon, where the walls were thin and the heat broke every other month and the ceiling groaned every time it rained. I didn't complain. I worked harder. I picked up an additional tutoring job at night, helping high school juniors with math and science for $20 an hour, which went straight into a mason jar I kept in the cupboard labeled tuition gap. The jar never stayed full, but it never stayed empty either. While other students were joining clubs, making friends, or flying home for weekends, I was memorizing organic chemistry terms on the bus and running experiments in the lab until the janitor kicked me out. I never once asked for a break. I didn't have time to socialize, and I couldn't risk slipping even slightly, because when you're funding your own future 1 hour at a time, failure isn't an option, it's a threat. A full-body threat that sits in your stomach and your lungs and your spine, reminding you that one wrong move means you go back to folding shirts under fluorescent lights, smiling politely at people who will never know your name. It wasn't all loneliness. Somewhere in the middle of my second semester, I caught the attention of Dr. Angela Rios, a professor who looked like she didn't have time for nonsense and spoke like every word she said cost someone money. She taught biology with a precision I hadn't seen before and a passion that burned low and steady like coals that never stopped glowing. She pulled me aside after a lab exam, looked over her glasses and said, "Who taught you to think like that?" I didn't know what to say. No one had ever asked me that before. She invited me to apply for a spot in her undergraduate research team. I hesitated at first, not because I didn't want it, but because I wasn't sure I could juggle anything else. But something in her tone told me this wasn't an invitation I'd get twice, so I nodded and said yes before I could overthink it. Working under Dr. Rios was like stepping into a different world. Her lab wasn't just a place of learning, it was a place of transformation. We worked on biomedical research focused on cellular regeneration, and even though I was just an undergrad, she treated me like a scientist. She gave me space to experiment, to present, to fail, and recover. She never asked about my family, never commented on my faded jeans or my empty lunches, but she noticed everything. Once she handed me a grant application packet without a word, just a post-it note that said, "You're ready." I filled it out on the floor of my apartment, between tutoring sessions and lab write-ups, and submitted it with fingers crossed so tightly they ached. 2 months later, I received an acceptance letter for a biomedical research fellowship funded by an international foundation. It included full travel costs, a stipend, housing, and the chance to work with a team based in Geneva. I read the letter 3 times before letting myself believe it was real. I didn't tell my parents. At that point, we hadn't spoken in nearly a year. The last time I went home, my mother complained about how quiet I'd become. And my father asked me if I'd considered getting a real job instead of wasting my time in classrooms. Louise had returned from Paris, empty-handed except for a slick new accent and a suitcase full of receipts. His business degree, the one they'd sacrificed so much for, turned out to be a joke. He dropped out 6 months before graduation and came back claiming the program was unrealistic and too theory-based. My parents defended him without hesitation. They cashed out part of their retirement to help him start a marketing firm. It barely lasted a year. I watched them hand him chance after chance, support wrapped in love and denial, while pretending I didn't exist. I never expected applause, but I thought maybe, just once, they might ask how I was doing. When they didn't, I stopped offering them updates. It wasn't silence out of spite. It was silence out of necessity. So when I packed my bags for Geneva, I did it alone. I folded my lab coat with more care than I had ever folded anything in my life, and slid it into the suitcase on top of my notebooks and one good pair of shoes. I flew across the ocean in economy class, between two strangers who didn't speak English, and I landed in a city where I didn't know a soul but felt more like myself than I ever had back home. My first day in the lab overseas was a blur of new faces and new protocols. The lead scientist, a woman from South Africa with a doctorate and a laugh like a thunderclap, shook my hand and said, "We've heard about you." I smiled politely, though I didn't understand what she meant until later that week, when I found my name listed as a co-author on an upcoming paper Dr. Rios had submitted before I left. I stood in the hallway that afternoon, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the call icon. For a moment, I thought about dialing my mother. I imagined her answering, confused but hopeful, maybe even proud. But the moment passed. I put the phone back in my pocket and returned to the lab. They had given Luis everything, and he had built nothing. I'd been given nothing, and I was building something real, something that would last. The irony didn't hurt anymore. It just felt like gravity, heavy, constant, inevitable, and I wasn't going to let it pull me down. There is a kind of irony so sharp, it doesn't even feel like pain when it cuts. It just feels like recognition, like finally seeing something for what it is, and realizing you've always known it in your bones. That was exactly how it felt watching my parents help Luis open his company while I, thousands of miles away, was pouring samples into centrifuges in a sterile lab wearing a coat with someone else's initials stitched onto the collar. I remember sitting in the corner of the lab one evening, scrolling through social media while waiting on a result. And there it was, a photo posted by my mother, framed by emojis and hollow captions, showing Luis standing in front of a glass office door with a gold decal that read, Mendez Media Group. My father stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder like a seal of approval, while my mother clutched a congratulatory bouquet of blue and silver balloons that matched absolutely nothing but screamed effort. I blinked at the screen for a full minute. No part of me was surprised. I had known this was coming from the moment they welcomed him back from Paris with zero accountability and twice the affection. After all, in our family, failure from a son was treated as a detour, while ambition from a daughter was treated as rebellion. They had invested over $100,000 in his education, only for him to come home with nothing but excuses, and they never once raised their voices. Instead, they opened another door for him, handed him more money, gave him another blank slate, and called it love. It wasn't love, it was tradition. And I knew then that I had never stood a chance of fitting into that mold, even if I'd wanted to. Luis didn't even know what kind of business he wanted to run. The media group was a phrase he pulled out of thin air because it sounded sleek, and within a month, he had an office space, 2 interns, and a website full of placeholder buzzwords. The business made no money, had no clients, and ran on aesthetics alone. My father called it vision. My mother said he was learning to be a leader. I knew better. He wasn't learning to lead. He was learning how to look busy enough to avoid confrontation, and they were going to let him. They always had. Meanwhile, I was rising through the ranks at my fellowship program, working under the supervision of scientists who had published books I'd studied in college, surrounded by minds that pulsed with the kind of intelligence you could almost feel in the air. Our work focused on regenerative medicine, specifically using stem cell data to enhance soft tissue repair in burn victims. It wasn't flashy, but it mattered. And for the first time, I felt like I was part of something that might genuinely make a difference. Each breakthrough came slowly. Some days were quiet, full of numbers and failures and do-overs. But once in a while, we got it right. And each time we did, they called me into the conference room. Not as a student, not as an assistant, as a contributor. I had written 2 sections in our latest paper and was being added as the 3rd author. One night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in the lab, staring at my name in the author lineup on a pre-published draft, and just let myself feel it for a moment. Not pride exactly, but arrival. Not loud, not announced, not even fully understood by anyone outside that room, but real. Back in the United States, Luisa's business was already unraveling. The first intern quit. The website went down for 3 weeks. The office, according to a mutual acquaintance, had become a glorified hangout space where he and his friends drank cold brew and watched YouTube videos under the pretense of creative brainstorming. The money they'd lent him, or rather given him, was already thinning. My mother took a part-time bookkeeping job. My father stopped going to church, but no one blamed Luis. It was the economy. It was COVID's fault. It was too much competition. It was never the fact that he didn't know what he was doing and had no desire to figure it out. By then, I had published a 3rd research paper and presented at a conference in Barcelona. I wore my best dress, one I had borrowed from a colleague, and I stood behind a podium that bore the emblem of an international science consortium. There were applause and handshakes and photos, and afterward, a soft-spoken woman from Brazil handed me a card with an invitation to collaborate on a clinical study next year. I smiled and thanked her, tucking the card into my notebook like it was just another scrap of paper, even though I knew I'd treasure it forever. I kept tabs on my family through whispers, through old classmates who still followed me online, through distant cousins who occasionally commented on my posts with things like, "Your parents must be so proud." I never responded. Pride wasn't something they had ever given me. I wasn't going to let them claim it now. Then it happened. One morning, still groggy from an all-nighter running data reports, I opened my email to find a message titled, "Nomination Confirmation, Global Research Awards." At first, I thought it was spam. But when I opened it, there it was. Official letterhead, my name in the 3rd paragraph, and the words, "Selected Finalist," in bold. The nomination came from Dr. Rios. The award ceremony would be broadcast internationally, and the winners would be announced live. I sat back, stunned. I hadn't even known she'd nominated me. I didn't call anyone, but someone else did. Later that week, while I was eating lunch in the break room, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. It was my mother. I stared at the screen while it rang, unreadable, uninvited, unwelcome. I didn't answer. I turned the phone face down on the table and let it go silent, because if I had picked up, I wouldn't have known what to say. And after everything, I didn't think I needed to say anything at all. The hotel they put me in for the Global Research Awards was too luxurious for my comfort. The kind of place where the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, and the towels felt thicker than the walls in my old apartment. It smelled like citrus and money, and when I stepped into the lobby, wearing a black dress I had spent nearly a full week debating whether or not I could afford, I felt like I had stepped into a world I was still not convinced I was allowed to belong in. My hair had been done by a stylist the event organizers had sent to my room. My shoes had been loaned by a friend from the lab whose taste far exceeded mine. And the moment I saw my reflection in the elevator mirror, I almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I didn't look like me, but because for the first time, I looked like the version of myself I had always pictured on the inside. The awards ceremony was being held in a historic venue in Vienna, the kind of place with gold trim on the ceilings and chandeliers that probably cost more than my father's house. I sat among people whose names I had only ever seen in textbooks or scientific journals, surrounded by brilliance that radiated in every direction, and yet no part of me felt small, not anymore, because I had earned my seat. I had bled for it, sacrificed for it, and I was finally starting to believe I didn't owe it to anyone but myself. The lights dimmed, the applause began, and one by one the presenters came on stage to announce winners across various categories. I wasn't nervous. I didn't need to win. The nomination alone had already stirred the ground back home in ways I could never have predicted. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the ceremony was being streamed online, on a public channel, accessible to anyone with a stable Wi-Fi connection and a bit of curiosity. Back in the small town I had left behind, the ripple had already become a wave. My cousin Natalia, the only one who had stayed in occasional contact, had shared the link on Facebook that morning. It didn't take long for the rest of the extended family to catch on, and soon the broadcast was being watched by more than just scholars and scientists. It was being watched by neighbors, distant relatives, childhood classmates, and yes, my parents. I hadn't told them I would be there. I hadn't invited them to watch, but they were watching all the same. I stood when my name was called, not for the final award, but for a special mention, a distinction reserved for a select few contributors whose work had redefined expectations in their fields. The camera panned across the audience, then landed on me as I walked to the stage. The applause was polite, consistent, and as I took the glass plaque from the presenter's hand and turned toward the mic, I allowed myself one long breath. What I said wasn't rehearsed. I hadn't written anything down, too afraid I'd overthink it and lose the nerve. But the words came easy once I opened my mouth, like they had been sitting in my throat all these years, just waiting for the right room to be set in. I want to thank the mentors who believed in me long before I had the courage to believe in myself. I began, voice steady, eyes fixed on no one in particular. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes the people who love us most don't always know how to love us best. Sometimes they fail us, not because they mean to, but because they don't see the shape of our dreams. But dreams don't need approval to exist. They just need space. I paused, scanning the room, feeling the weight of it all settle on my shoulders in the best possible way. To every girl who was told she wasn't worth the investment, build yourself anyway. I stepped back as the applause swelled. My name flashed briefly on the bottom of the screen, alongside a small biography listing my research focus, university affiliation, and hometown. The camera zoomed in one last time on my face before cutting to the next honoree. But that moment, those few seconds, had already traveled miles. My mother, who once told me that women didn't need college because they had husbands, sat in the living room with her hands clenched around a glass of water that had long since gone warm. My father, who had once asked why I kept filling my head with nonsense instead of finding someone to take care of me, watched the screen in silence, his mouth pulled tight, jaw clenched like a man who had swallowed his pride too quickly. And Luis, whose company had officially dissolved 3 weeks prior due to unpaid taxes and a lawsuit from a disgruntled contractor, stood by the hallway doorway and stared blankly at the TV, like someone watching a ghost perform a magic trick. According to Natalia, no one spoke for a full minute after my name disappeared from the screen. Then slowly, my mother stood and walked into the kitchen without a word. My father reached for the remote, turned off the television, and stared at the blank screen as if expecting it to light back up and change the ending. It didn't. Later that night, my phone rang. It was a video call this time, not just a voicemail. I recognized the number instantly. I didn't answer. I watched the screen light up, flash once, twice, then fade to black. A few moments later, a text followed. "We saw you. We want to talk." I turned the phone over and placed it face down on the dresser. Then I went back to the mirror, wiped off my makeup, and looked at myself for a long, unhurried moment. The woman looking back at me had nothing left to prove. Because the truth was, I didn't need them to see me succeed in order for the success to matter. But they had seen me now, and they couldn't unsee it. The voicemail came 2 days later, just after I landed back home, my suitcase half-zipped and still full of dresses and folders and small, carefully packed items that reminded me of the week I had just lived. A week of applause, recognition, and the kind of quiet validation that doesn't require a spotlight to feel significant. The sun was beginning to set through the slats of my living room blinds, casting a kind of soft orange light across the couch where I had dropped everything the moment I walked in. The apartment smelled faintly of dust and unopened windows, the kind of smell that only happens when you've been gone long enough to forget you have a life that doesn't revolve around airports and award speeches. I had ignored the call when it came through, as I had ignored the last 3. My mother had texted the morning after the ceremony with something so brief it read more like a transaction than a message. "We're proud. Can we talk?" There was no punctuation, no explanation, no attempt to bridge the 2-year silence. Just 5 words, 52 characters, sent out into the world like that was all it would take to rewrite the script. She followed it with a missed call, then another, and finally a voicemail from my father, which I let sit in my inbox unopened for hours. I listened to it that night, but only once. His voice came through the speaker, quieter than I remembered, slower too, as if the words had to push through something before they could reach me. He didn't start with an apology. He didn't say he was sorry for the years of dismissal, or the way he had ignored every milestone that didn't come from my brother's mouth. He didn't mention the graduation ceremony they never attended, or the countless times I came home from work with blisters on my feet and lab reports tucked under my arm, like secrets I had to carry alone. He didn't reference the years of telling me no, telling me not now, telling me maybe one day when I had a family of my own to focus on. Instead, he said, "You make us proud," and followed it with a kind of strained silence, the kind that makes you wonder whether the speaker still has more to say or simply doesn't know how to say any of it. He ended with the words, "We didn't know," and I couldn't tell if he meant they hadn't known how far I would go, or if they hadn't known how badly they had underestimated me. I didn't call him back. Not because I was angry, though for a long time I had been. Not because I wanted to punish him, or my mother, or Luis, or any of the people who had spent so many years pretending not to see me. I didn't call because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said by my absence. Because I had spent too many years explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was worth, and I had finally reached a place where I no longer felt obligated to correct them. The truth is, I didn't want an apology. I didn't want praise. I didn't even want acknowledgement. I just wanted peace. And for the first time, I had it. I spent the next week catching up on lab work, cleaning my apartment, replying to emails from young women who had watched the ceremony, and sent messages asking how I had gotten there, what classes I had taken, which books I had read. I responded to every single one, not out of vanity, but out of something closer to duty, a responsibility to reach back and steady the hands that were still climbing, still fighting, still trying to believe they were allowed to take up space. One girl, a sophomore from Texas, ended her email with a line I couldn't stop thinking about. She wrote, "I've never seen someone like you do something like that. And now I think maybe I can too." I read her message 3 times, then printed it out and pinned it to the bulletin board above my desk. It reminded me that impact isn't always measured in applause or plaques or ceremonies. Sometimes it's measured in the silence that comes after a voice has been heard for the first time. A few weeks later, Dr. Rios and I met for coffee. It was a Sunday, and the sun was high and warm, and I was wearing a sweater I had bought for myself after the awards with money I would have never spent on something frivolous before. She sat across from me, stirring her espresso with the same focus she gave to test tubes and grant applications. And after we had caught up on the surface level things, the new paper, the upcoming conference, she looked at me and said, "Would you do it differently?" I didn't answer right away. I sipped my drink, watched the way the foam settled along the edges of the cup, and let the question hang in the air like a thread waiting to be pulled. Finally, I said, "No, Tahoe," because I wouldn't, because every missed call, every dismissed ambition, every lonely night and silent breakfast and condescending remark had shaped the fire I had carried. Because without all of it, I might have spent my whole life waiting for permission instead of learning how to build without it. She nodded, didn't press. She didn't need to. We both understood that some stories don't get tied up neatly, that some endings don't come with redemption or reconciliation or the perfect final scene. Some stories just close, like a door you finally stop holding open, and what matters most is that you walked through it. Later that night, as I sat at my desk reviewing a grant proposal, my phone buzzed again. Another number I recognized. Another call I didn't take. I silenced it without looking and returned to the document. There were deadlines to meet. There were students to mentor. There were studies to design and papers to publish, and whole futures waiting to be built from the blueprints of a past I no longer needed to explain. I didn't need them to be proud. I just needed them to remember who I became without them. And now they would. They would remember every time someone said my name, every time my research made headlines, every time a girl like me stood on a stage I once built with my own hands and said, without apology, I earned this, and I would never have to say another word.